Imagine returning home after time of service, secretly planning to surprise your mother at the diner in your hometown, only to walk in and see a white sheriff towering over her, shouting while she clutches her cheek, red with pain from a brutal slap. That's exactly what happened to Darius Kane, a black Navy SEAL who thought he was stepping into a joyful reunion. Not violence, not humiliation, not his mother crumpled on the floor of a Minnesota diner, while an entire room of people sat frozen, too terrified to intervene. In a single moment, the town's most feared authority crossed a line he could never take back. And Darius realized the elderly woman bleeding on that checkered floor wasn't just another victim of small-town tyranny. She was his mother. The slap had already echoed through Washington Diner by the time Darius pushed through the door. Sharp, brutal, final, the kind of sound that cuts through morning conversation and stops hearts mid-beat. Nadia Kane lay on the tile, hot tea pooling around Barrett Voss's polished shoes. Her dignified posture shattered along with the silence she'd kept for time, the silence about the threatening notes, the pressure to sell her home, the late-night patrol cars parked outside her house. One violent act, one protected man thinking he was untouchable, one son trained to neutralize threats walking into the worst moment of his life. Have you ever witnessed someone in power abuse an innocent person while everyone just stood there watching? What would you do if that person was your mother? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe no mother should ever face violence, then hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story. The slap had already landed by the time anyone could process what had happened. Nadia Kane reeled backward from the impact, her hand flying instinctively to her reddened cheek as hot tea splashed across Barrett Voss's polished shoes and pooled on the checkered floor beneath them. The sound, sharp, brutal, final, reverberated through the diner like a gunshot, freezing every patron mid-motion. Forks hovered above plates. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. The low hum of morning conversation died so completely that the only sound left was the faint drip of liquid hitting tile. The diner itself seemed to shrink inward, as if the walls could feel the weight of what had just occurred. Washington Diner had always carried an oppressive atmosphere, especially in recent years, the kind of heaviness that settled into the vinyl booths and clung to the faded yellow curtains. A tension so familiar that locals had learned to breathe around it. Patrons kept their heads down, their voices low, their movements careful. They knew better than to draw attention. Fear had become as much a fixture here as the cracked leather stools at the counter or the flickering neon sign outside that read, "Open 24 hours, but never quite glowed the way it used to." Barrett Voss was the reason why. Sheriff Barrett Voss, to be exact, a white man with a thick build, a badge that gleamed too brightly under the fluorescent lights, and a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. He sat now near the center of the diner, legs sprawled wide, boots stretched deliberately into the narrow aisle where anyone trying to pass would have to navigate around him. He'd been sitting that way, sipping black coffee and watching the door with the lazy confidence of someone who knew no one would challenge him. No one ever did. Nadia had arrived just after sunrise, moving slowly but with quiet dignity. Her coat was buttoned neatly despite the warmth of early summer, her posture straight despite the weariness etched into her shoulders. She greeted the cashier with a soft nod, her voice barely above a whisper, and made her way toward the booth near the back where she'd been told to wait. The message had come anonymously. A note slipped under her door prior, asking her to meet someone important at the diner this morning. She didn't know who, she didn't know why, but something about it felt necessary. So, she came. She carried her tea carefully, both hands wrapped around the ceramic mug for warmth and stability. Her steps were measured, cautious, the result of decades navigating a world that didn't always make space for elderly black women. As she passed Barrett's table, the hem of her coat brushed lightly against his outstretched leg. Barely a touch, no stumble, no spill, no reaction. She didn't even realize it had happened. She continued to her booth, set the tea down gently, and folded her hands in her lap, waiting. That's when the chair scraped. The sound was deliberate, loud enough to cut through the ambient noise like nails on a chalkboard. Barrett stood abruptly, his bulk casting a shadow across the tables nearby. His voice came next, sharp and cutting. "You think you can just walk into me like that?" Nadia turned slowly, confusion flickering across her weathered face. She blinked, trying to place what he meant. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice soft, apologetic. "I didn't—" He closed the distance in 3 strides and slapped her. The impact sent her sideways, her body crumpling against the edge of the booth before she hit the floor hard. The tea she'd been carrying moments before tipped and spilled, the hot liquid spreading in a dark stain across Barrett's shoes and onto the checkered tiles. Nadia lay there, stunned. One hand pressed to her cheek, which was already beginning to swell. Her eyes shimmered with pain and shock as she tried to push herself upright. Barrett stood over her, chest heaving, his face flushed with anger that seemed disproportionate to the imagined offense. "Apologize," he demanded, his voice booming. "You spill on me, you apologize." He looked around the room, daring anyone to intervene. No one did. Heads stayed down, eyes averted. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one moved. No one spoke. This was how it always went in this town. Barrett had ruled over this community for nearly a decade, not just with the authority of his badge, but with something darker, an unspoken system of extortion and intimidation that had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. He pressured business owners into paying for protection. He forced struggling families to sell their properties at a fraction of their worth, funneling the land into shadowy development deals that lined his pockets. He profiled, harassed, and humiliated anyone who didn't fit his vision of who belonged here. Nadia had been one of his targets for time. Anonymous notes warning her to sell, veiled threats about property taxes and code violations, offers that grew increasingly aggressive, increasingly demeaning. She'd refused every time, clinging to the modest home she'd shared with her late husband, the place where she'd raised her son, the last piece of stability she had left. And now, she lay on the diner floor, pain radiating through her face, humiliation burning hotter than the tea that had spilled. Barrett crouched slightly, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Old women like you need to learn respect." That's when the door chimed. The sound was soft, almost musical, cutting through the suffocating silence with an incongruous lightness. Every head in the diner turned instinctively toward the entrance. Darius Kane stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his frame filling the doorway in a way that commanded immediate attention. Dressed in civilian clothes, a simple black t-shirt and jeans, he moved with the kind of controlled economy that came from years of training. His eyes scanned the room automatically, the way they'd been trained to do, taking in exits, threats, positioning. He registered the unnatural stillness first, the way conversations had died mid-sentence, the way bodies were angled away from something at the center of the room. Then his gaze landed on the woman on the floor. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mother, the woman he'd flown halfway across the world to surprise. The woman he'd arranged this anonymous meeting with, carefully orchestrating every detail so he could walk in and see the joy on her face when she realized her son had come home. The woman who'd raised him alone after his father died, who'd worked double shifts to keep food on the table, who'd never once asked him for anything. She was crumpled on the diner floor, hand pressed to her reddened cheek, tears streaking silently down her face. And standing over her, smug and expectant, was Barrett Voss. Darius's training kicked in before his rage could. His breathing remained steady. His expression stayed neutral, but his hands, hanging loosely at his sides, flexed once, a subtle release of tension that anyone who knew combat would recognize as preparation. He moved forward, his steps deliberate but unhurried, closing the distance between the door and his mother with a kind of calm that preceded storms. Patrons watched him approach, some with dawning hope, others with creeping fear for what might happen next. Barrett noticed him then, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. He straightened to his full height, crossing his arms over his chest. Darius reached Nadia and crouched beside her, his large frame folding down with surprising gentleness. He didn't touch her yet, didn't speak. His eyes swept over her face, cataloguing the damage, the reddened cheek, the split skin near her eye, the way she trembled. Then he looked up at Barrett, and Barrett, looking down at the stranger who dared step into his domain, had no idea he'd just ignited something he couldn't control. The diner held its breath. Outside, morning light continued to filter through the dusty windows. Birds sang. Traffic hummed in the distance. Life went on, oblivious. But inside Washington Diner, in that small Minnesota town where fear had learned to sit comfortably, everything was about to change. Darius's voice, when it came, was quiet, almost conversational. "Are you hurt?" Nadia looked up at him, confusion and recognition warring in her eyes. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged at first. She blinked, trying to reconcile the impossible. Her son, who should be thousands of miles away, kneeling beside her on a diner floor, stained with spilled tea. She nodded once, a small, reluctant admission. "He hit you?" Another nod, slower this time. Her eyes darted toward Barrett, then back to Darius, a lifetime of learned caution, making her hesitate even now. Darius's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To anyone watching closely, it was the only visible sign of the earthquake building inside him. Memories crashed through his mind in rapid succession. Growing up in this town, watching his mother navigate spaces that didn't welcome her, witnessing the subtle and overt cruelty she'd endured with grace he'd never fully understood until he was older. He remembered being young, watching a store clerk follow her through aisles, assuming theft before purchase. Hearing neighbors complain about property values when she planted flowers in the front yard. Holding her as she cried after his father's funeral. Watching her square her shoulders the next morning and go back to work, because bills didn't pause for grief. His Navy SEAL training had taught him control, discipline, the ability to compartmentalize rage and channel it into precision. That training was being tested now in ways basic underwater demolition hadn't prepared him for. Barrett's voice cut through the moment, dripping with condescension. "You got a problem?" Darius stood slowly, unfolding to his full height. He was taller than Barrett, broader through the shoulders, but he carried his size differently. No swagger, no posturing, just presence. "She apologized," Darius said evenly. "You still hit her." Barrett scoffed, a sound that bordered on laughter. "She spilled on me, disrespected me in my town." He took a step closer, invading Darius's space, the way he'd done to countless others, expecting the same retreat he always got. "I don't know who you think you are walking in here." "I think I'm someone asking you a question," Darius interrupted, his tone unchanged. "Did you hit her?" The diner had gone impossibly quieter. Patrons who'd been staring at their plates now risked glances toward the confrontation, sensing something different about this exchange. Barrett's face flushed darker. "You need to mind your business before you end up in a cell. Or worse." The threat hung in the air, familiar to everyone present. They'd heard variations of it before. Warnings disguised as concern. Authority wielded like a weapon. Darius didn't move, didn't blink. Around them, the diner's history pressed in. Years of Barrett's escalating control. His transformation from simply corrupt to openly tyrannical. Patrons remembered. Patrons. They remembered old man Fletcher, who'd refused to sell his hardware store, only to face a sudden investigation into his finances that bankrupted him within time. They remembered the Johnsons, a black family who tried to open a barbecue restaurant, running into permit issues that never seemed to resolve until they gave up and left town. They remembered Sarah Kim, the Korean-American teacher who'd filed a complaint about Barrett's treatment of her teenage son, only to find herself pulled over weekly for routine checks until she requested a transfer to another district. And they remembered Nadia specifically, the notes that started appearing on her door time ago, The way Barrett's patrol car began parking outside her house during evening shifts. The offers to buy her property that came with barely veiled threats about safety and neighborhood changes. Everyone knew, and everyone had stayed silent, because that's what you did when someone held all the power. Darius's next words were directed at the room, not Barrett. Did anyone else see him hit her? Silence. Then, slowly, an elderly white man near the window raised his hand slightly. Then a middle-aged woman by the counter nodded. Then another, and another. 5 people total. Their acknowledgements small but significant. Barrett's expression shifted from irritation to something harder. You're making a mistake. Darius finally let himself move, stepping between Barrett and his mother, putting his body as a barrier. The movement was deliberate, protective, unmistakable in its message. Barrett reached for his belt, fingers brushing the grip of his service weapon. Darius's hand shot out faster than anyone could track, clamping around Barrett's wrist with precise pressure that made the sheriff's fingers go numb. The gun stayed holstered, but Barrett's eyes widened with the sudden realization that he wasn't in control of this situation. Don't, Darius said quietly. Then he moved. The strikes came in rapid succession, each one calculated, controlled, devastating. A palm strike to the solar plexus that folded Barrett forward, an elbow to the jaw that snapped his head sideways, a sweep that took his legs out from under him. Darius's training showed in every motion, no wasted energy, no excessive force, just enough to neutralize the threat and make a point that had been years in the making. Barrett hit the floor hard, gasping for air, his face already beginning to swell. He tried to speak, to issue orders, to reclaim authority, but the words came out garbled and weak. Darius stood over him, breathing steady, hands relaxed at his sides. Around them, the diner had erupted in gasps and whispers, patrons half standing from their booths, phones appearing to record what no one would have believed without evidence. Barrett, desperate now, managed to choke out words through his split lip. I didn't know she was your mother." Darius crouched down, bringing his face level with Barrett's, his voice cold and clear. "Wouldn't have mattered if she wasn't." The words landed with more force than any of the blows had, because they exposed the truth everyone had known but never said aloud, that Barrett's violence wasn't just about power. It was about who he thought deserved protection and who didn't. In the distance, growing louder, sirens began to wail. The diner exploded into motion. Chairs scraped against linoleum as patrons finally allowed themselves to move, to react, to become participants rather than witnesses. Phones lifted higher, recording from multiple angles. Voices overlapped. Gasps, questions, statements spoken aloud after years of being swallowed. The atmosphere shifted palpably, fear transforming into something that resembled hope, or perhaps vindication. Darius stepped back from Barrett's prone form, his hands visible, palms open. His breathing remained controlled, each inhale and exhale measured from years of training that had prepared him for combat zones, but not quite for this. Violence in defense of family. Justice served on the floor of a hometown diner. 2 patrol cars pulled up outside, lights flashing red and blue through the dusty windows. 4 officers entered, their postures immediately tense as they took in the scene. Sheriff Barrett Voss on the floor, blood trickling from his nose and mouth, and a tall black man standing over him, surrounded by a restaurant full of witnesses. The lead officer, a white man named Deputy Thorne, recognized Barrett immediately. His hand moved toward his weapon, but stopped halfway as he processed the fuller picture. Barrett's aggressive positioning, the elderly woman being helped into a booth by other patrons, the way everyone seemed focused not on the stranger, but on their sheriff, with expressions that mixed satisfaction and long-suppressed anger. "What happened here?" Thorne demanded, his voice carrying the automatic authority of law enforcement, but also a thread of uncertainty. He'd worked under Barrett for time, knew his reputation, had turned blind eyes to situations that made him uncomfortable, told himself that keeping his job and his family fed mattered more than bucking the system. Now that system was cracking open in front of him. No one spoke at first. Then an elderly white woman near the window, Mrs. Patterson, stood shakily. Her voice quavered but held firm. The sheriff hit her. That elderly lady there, he hit her for nothing, for accidentally brushing past his leg. She spilled tea on him, another patron added, a man in a trucker's cap. Apologized right away. He hit her anyway, hard. I saw it too, confirmed the cashier, a young Latina woman who'd worked at Washington Diner for time and who'd personally witnessed Barrett's harassment of customers more times than she could count. He slapped her. She fell. Then this man came in and protected her. The testimonies overlapped, building into a chorus that couldn't be ignored or dismissed, each voice adding details. Barrett's aggressive posture, Nadia's apology, the excessive force of the slap, the way she'd crumpled to the floor, Darius's restrained intervention. Thorne looked between Barrett and Darius, clearly struggling. His partner, a younger officer named Leung, had already started taking notes, documenting witness names and contact information with an efficiency that suggested relief at having clear protocol to follow. "Arrest him," Barrett wheezed, pointing at Darius. "Assaulting an officer." "I want him." "We need to see the footage," Leung interrupted, his voice steady. He gestured toward the security camera mounted in the corner, its small red light indicating it had been recording everything. Thorne hesitated. The connections Barrett had throughout the department were well known. Several officers owed him favors. Others had witnessed his behavior but never reported it, making them complicit. Arresting him, even temporarily, could mean career consequences, internal investigations, retaliation. But Leung was already asking the cashier to pull up the security footage on the office computer. They watched in silence, the small screen showing grainy but clear images. Nadia walking past Barrett's outstretched leg, the barely there brush of fabric, her continued path toward her booth. Barrett standing abruptly, his aggressive approach. Nadia turning, confused, apologetic. The slap, brutal and unprovoked. Her falling, the tea spilling. Barrett standing over her, demanding apology from a woman on the floor. Then Darius entering, the confrontation. Barrett reaching for his weapon. Darius's swift neutralization. The footage didn't lie, couldn't be argued with, couldn't be spun. Thorne exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly as the decision became inevitable. "Barrett Voss," he said formally, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for assault." Barrett's face contorted with disbelief and rage. "You can't. I'm the sheriff. I'm your superior. This is insubordination. I'll have your badge." "You have the right to remain silent," Thorne continued, his voice gaining strength as he committed to the path. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Thorne cuffed him, reading him his rights with Leung's assistance, Nadia stood shakily from where other patrons had helped her sit. Her eyes met Darius's across the diner, and recognition finally settled fully. Not just that her son had returned, but that he had orchestrated this anonymous meeting, had planned this surprise, had wanted nothing more than to see her face light up with joy. Instead, he'd found her on the floor. But something else passed between them in that moment, too. Gratitude, pride, love that had weathered decades of separation and hardship. Darius moved toward her, his expression softening for the first time since entering, and Nadia reached for him with trembling hands. Around them, the whispers grew. "Did you know Barrett tried to force the Hendersons to sell their farm? He's been extorting the auto shop for time. My cousin filed a complaint time ago. It disappeared." The revelations came faster now, each patron emboldened by the others, by the sight of Barrett in handcuffs, by the sudden sense that maybe, finally, the truth could be spoken aloud without consequence. Leung documented everything, his pen moving steadily across his notepad, creating an official record of corruption that would take time to fully untangle. Thorne loaded Barrett into the back of the patrol car, the sheriff's protests muffled by the closed door. As he returned to the diner to collect final statements, he approached Darius directly. "I need your information," he said, not unkindly. "For the report." Darius provided his name, his military ID, showing his Navy SEAL status, his current leave status, his mother's address as local contact. Thorne studied the ID, something like respect crossing his features. "Thank you for your service," he said quietly, then even quieter, "and for what you did here." Outside, the morning had fully arrived. The sun climbed higher. The town continued its daily rhythm, unaware yet of the shift that had occurred inside Washington Diner. But inside, as Barrett was driven away and witnesses gave their statements, and the security footage was officially logged as evidence, something fundamental had changed. Fear, which had sat so comfortably for so long, had been evicted. Nadia's arms wrapped around Darius with a strength that defied her age and recent trauma. She trembled against him, her face pressed into his chest, and he held her carefully, aware of her bruised cheek, her fragile frame, the decades of resilience that had brought her to this moment. Around them, the diner had settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the oppressive silence of fear, but the softer hush of collective processing, of people trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Thorne finished taking Darius's statement, his professionalism unable to completely mask his discomfort with the situation's broader implications. If Barrett had been abusing his authority this openly, how many officers had known? How many complaints had been buried? How deep did the corruption run? "We'll need you available for follow-up," Thorne said, handing Darius a card with case numbers and contact information. "Given your military status and the circumstances, I don't anticipate charges, but there will be an investigation." Darius nodded once, his attention already returning to his mother. Leung emerged from the office with copies of the security footage, properly logged and documented. The cashier had made multiple backups without being asked, her own small rebellion against years of watching and saying nothing. As the officers prepared to leave, Leung paused near the door, surveying the room full of witnesses who'd finally spoken. "If anyone has additional information about Sheriff Voss's conduct," he announced, "official complaints can be filed at the station. They will be taken seriously." The promise hung in the air, fragile but significant. Several patrons nodded, making mental notes, perhaps already drafting accounts they'd been too afraid to voice before. After the officers departed, the diner remained animated with conversation. Mrs. Patterson approached Nadia hesitantly, her weathered hands clasped together. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have said something sooner. When he started bothering you about your house. I should have." Nadia reached out, squeezing the older woman's hand. "We were all afraid." "But you weren't." Mrs. Patterson looked at Darius. "Your son wasn't afraid." Darius met her gaze evenly. "I was trained not to be, but everyone in this room found their courage today. You all spoke up when it mattered." The validation seemed to lift something from the gathered patrons. Conversations grew more animated, voices rising not in fear, but in shared relief. Stories emerged that had been suppressed for years. Barrett's pattern of racial profiling, his targeting of anyone who challenged his authority, the web of intimidation and extortion that had kept an entire community silent. The man in the trucker's cap, whose name was Bill, revealed that Barrett had threatened to revoke his commercial driving license over fabricated violations unless he paid monthly fees. The cashier, Elena, shared that Barrett had harassed her younger brother, a high school senior, pulling him over repeatedly until the family considered moving to another town. Others came forward with similar accounts, property pressures like Nadia had faced, business licensing issues that resolved only after payments were made, traffic stops that escalated into searches without cause. Each story added weight to the case building against Barrett, but more importantly, each story lifted weight from the person telling it. Darius listened, his arm still around his mother's shoulders, as the full scope of Barrett's corruption revealed itself. His training had prepared him for identifiable enemies, hostile combatants, clear threats, defined missions. This was different. This was systemic rot, the kind that grew when good people stayed silent, when institutions failed to police themselves, when fear became normalized. Nadia's looked up at him, her eyes still wet but clearing. "You planned this," she said quietly. "The anonymous meeting, it was you." He nodded. "I wanted to surprise you. I wanted to see your face when you realized I was home." Her expression crumbled and reformed into something between heartbreak and fierce pride. "You saw me on the floor instead." "I saw you being strong," Darius corrected gently. "The way you've always been." She shook her head slightly, the movement careful around her bruised cheek. "I wasn't strong. I was scared. I've been scared for time." "And you still came to that meeting. You still walked past him. You still got back up." Darius's voice lowered, meant only for her. "That's not weakness, Mom. That's survival. That's strength he'll never understand." Around them, the conversations continued, but several patrons were already on their phones, words spreading through the small town's network of family and friends. By afternoon, the story would be everywhere. By evening, news vans might arrive, drawn by the sensational elements: corrupt sheriff, decorated Navy SEAL, dramatic confrontation, but hopefully also by the underlying truth of how a community had been silenced and what it took to break that silence. When the diner finally cleared, only Darius, Nadia, and the manager remained. The manager, a quiet man named Tom, who'd owned Washington Diner for time, approached their booth. "No charge," he said simply, gesturing to the untouched food that had been ordered and forgotten during the chaos. "And Darius, thank you. I've wanted to tell Barrett off for years, didn't have the guts." "It's not about guts," Darius replied. "It's about having the right tools, the right moment, the right witnesses." Tom nodded slowly, understanding the lesson. Individual courage mattered, but systematic change required community action, documentation, and institutional accountability. After Tom returned to his office, Darius and Nadia sat in the quiet diner, the evening sun casting long shadows through the windows. "What happens now?" Nadia asked. "Now you decide," Darius said. "About the house, about staying, about everything Barrett tried to take from you." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of a water glass. "I'm keeping the house," she said finally, her voice steady. "He tried to make me feel small, tried to make me afraid to stay in my own home. But I'm not small, and I'm not afraid anymore." Darius smiled, pride evident in his expression. "No, you're not." "And you?" she asked. "How long are you home?" "Leave time, then I go back." He paused. "But I'm requesting a transfer, close a base so I can be here more." Nadia's eyes welled again, but these tears were different. Relief, joy, the overwhelming knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. Outside Washington Diner, the small Minnesota town continued its evening routine. But inside, in that booth by the window, where morning violence had given way to afternoon justice and evening peace, a mother and son sat together, planning a future that had nearly been stolen, but was now reclaimed. The story would spread, as stories do. It would be shared on social media, discussed in neighboring towns, possibly covered by regional news outlets. Some would focus on the sensational aspects, the violence, the confrontation, the dramatic arrest. Others would dig deeper, uncovering Barrett's full pattern of abuse, exposing the systemic failures that had allowed it to continue. But the most important impact wouldn't be measured in views or shares or headlines. It would be measured in the other voices that emerged, emboldened by witnessing justice served, in the other communities that began examining their own power structures, in the other sons and daughters who learned that protecting the vulnerable sometimes required confronting the powerful, in the other mothers who realized their dignity had never been dependent on anyone's permission. Darius and Nadia left the diner as twilight settled over the town, walking slowly toward the home that was hers and would remain hers. The home where she'd raised him to be strong and compassionate, and brave enough to stand between cruelty and its victims. The slap that had echoed through Washington Diner that morning had been meant to reinforce silence. Instead, it shattered it, and in the space where fear had lived, something more durable took root. The knowledge that justice, though delayed, though imperfect, though requiring courage from ordinary people in extraordinary moments, was still possible. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.